Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second lecture.
Can you tilt this down?
That's good. Okay, I wanted to continue today with our discussion of the basic nature of metaphysics, and in particular to focus on some of the objections that have been raised to the possibility of metaphysics. So there's a school, a number of schools of thought that claim that metaphysics isn't really possible in the traditional sense, that we can't really fruitfully inquire into the ultimate nature of reality or the basic structure of reality, and there are a number of different arguments that have been put forward to suggest that. So that material is in the section of the introduction historical dictionary called Anti-Metaphysics. And so I have here a number of different forms of anti-metaphysics: relativism, nihilism, skepticism, Kantianism and Wittgensteinianism, positivism. That is the last of the... So I wanted to go through these various forms of anti-metaphysics today. Look at some of the arguments. One of the most important is relativism. This goes back to the pre-Socratic sophist Protagoras of Abdera. Abdera is sort of between Turkey and northern Greece and Bulgaria. I guess it corresponds to an area known as Thrace in the ancient world. So anyway, Protagoras came from there. And his famous statement is that man is the measure of all things. Of what is, that it is. Of what is not, that it is not. And so you can see this guy was a master of rhetorical speech, which was one of the selling points of the sophists. They sort of set up shop as individuals who could train you to become successful through the mastery of rhetoric and persuasive speech. So sort of like how to be successful in the world, and we'll teach you how to use words to influence people. And, they were some of the first also trainers of lawyers. And would train them to argue both sides. You can argue either side of the case equally well to defend your client. In a sense, in some sense of truth, the truth isn't important. It's persuading others that you're right about whatever you're trying to convince them of. So Protagoras says that existence, right, is therefore relative to man in some sense. Man is the measure of all things, and in particular of existence, of what is, of what exists, that it exists, and of what doesn't exist, that it doesn't exist. It is in relation to man. Now, man could have two interpretations there. You might mean mankind. I mean, Greeks were male chauvinists, so women were sort of left out, but we could interpret mankind as including men and women to update the theory, which is what we should do, of course. So one interpretation is that mankind as a whole is the measure. And the other way to go would be the idea of an even more extreme kind of subjectivist relativism, which would say that it's the individual person who's that what exists is relative to the individual, right? To you or me, him, as opposed to mankind as a whole. So there are two ways to go at trying to understand what the relativist says. Protagoras in general said that seeming is prior to being, so how things seem to be to man precedes what exists or what has been. This is not the standard view of traditional metaphysics, which says that existence is the first thing, and then people are among the things that exist, and things may seem to be a certain way to a certain person or not, and so that for them, traditional metaphysicians like Aristotle, being is prior to seeming. But for Protagoras and many of the sophists, how things seem to be precedes and is presupposed by what is in the world. So what are some possibilities for understanding or interpreting the somewhat cryptic pronouncement of Protagoras is that man is the measure? Okay, so one interpretation is that necessarily for any x, where x could be anything, x exists if and only if everybody believes in x's existence. So let me make some comments here about what we're doing here. First of all, we have an if and only if. That's called a biconditional. So it says that x exists if everybody believes in x's existence. So that's saying what? That believing in everybody's believing in x's existence is a sufficient condition for x's existence. But it also says for any x exists only if everybody believes in x's existence. So it's saying what, therefore, that everybody's believing in x's existence is a necessary condition of x's existence. And it's saying that this is necessarily the case. So it's saying necessarily x, basically saying necessarily x exists if and only if everybody believes in x's existence. Okay. Now, we need the necessarily because a biconditional just by itself is very weak. If you didn't have a necessarily in the sense of if and only if in question, you can say, for example, that the sky is blue if and only if Obama is president. Any two propositions with the same truth value can have a biconditional put between them. So that doesn't tell you anything, right? It's not interesting to know that Obama is president if and only if the sky is blue, right? When you put the necessarily in front of it, though, then And it says it's a necessary connection between the two things, such that one can be true if and only if the other is true, or if one is true if and only it must be the case that the first is true if and only if the second is true, which is what you want if you want a strong philosophical connection between the two things. The necessarily is even stronger than, say, a causal connection. Right? Like you might say, there's smoke if and only if there's fire, something like that. But that would be a contingent connection, though it's stronger than just a simple material conditional, which just says both things have the same truth value. But a necessary is much stronger than a causal connection, because smoke and fire might be constantly conjoined, but that doesn't mean that necessarily they are, right? You might be able to make a fire without smoke, by blowing it away. Yeah.
I keep thinking, does it have to be, I may walk into something here, but does it have to be like real life? Do you know what I mean? Like, I kept thinking, okay, some people believe in God, but not everyone does. So does that mean that, you know, it doesn't exist since everybody doesn't believe in its existence?
This is just a proposal, right? So proposals are open to refutation.
Okay.
And this, after all, is a relativist theory of existence, which I can tell you in advance. Like, I think that in metaphysics and in our folk ontology, or common sense perspective, we're inclined to strongly tilt towards a notion of absolute existence. That existence is not something that's relative. So I expect there to be counterexamples to these things. So your question is, would God be a possible counterexample to this? Well, if it's possible for God to exist, even though some people don't believe that he exists, then that would show that this is incorrect. Right? Or on the other hand, if it's possible that everybody believes in God, but nonetheless God still doesn't exist, that would also refute.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted kind of like an example that was in my head.
Yeah, yeah. So does that help? Yeah. All right, so just wanted to say some more about ifs and only ifs before we get into actually dissecting these. So you're getting a little bit ahead of me there. So when you have a necessarily if and only if, which I said you need to have anything interesting. Okay. Suppose we have that. There are three different ways that could be interpreted, though, or put forth. Three different kinds of necessary if and only if situations. Okay. I mean, they're all necessarily if and only ifs, but they can have different philosophical significance. So I want to talk about that. One of the ideas of a necessarily if and only if is that the two things that are linked mean exactly the same thing. They are literal synonyms. An example of that would be, say, X is a television. If and only if X is a TV. All right, now, and of course we could say necessarily. Here we have, now what is TV? What are the letters TV? Yeah, what is it? It's an abbreviation. It's an abbreviation for television, right? So the two things mean exactly the same thing. So we're just saying here that these two expressions are totally synonymous and mean exactly the same. So it's not too interesting, right? We're just indicating the fact that we have two expressions that are literally exactly the same meaning. And that generally happens when you have an abbreviation, one expression that's an abbreviation for another expression. Yeah.
Based on this, could you in turn make your own conclusion that it's by saying that X is television if X is a TV, you're saying that basically I'm saying X is television if TV is anagram for television, right? Because you could say something like
if it's a television, it's a TV. If it's a TV, right, it's a television. Both of these are necessarily true because we're talking about exactly the same thing. And they mean the same thing.
Right. So then if you use like original thought to think that, make the connection between the anagram T or the, what am I trying to say, the initials TV to mean television by applying the idea that it's short for television.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a shorthand. The exact line between synonyms and expressions that are equivalent but not synonyms is like hard to precisely draw. Take another example, like is a little less clear, would be vixen and female fox. Is vixen just as a synonym or a shorter way of saying female fox? Maybe, right? So there might be other examples, but abbreviations provide the simplest examples. Right, so clearly we're not dealing with that here, right? No, we can't say that existence is just a synonym for everybody believing, right? That's not what's going on. So another possibility, other than the abbreviation thing, is the idea of philosophical analysis. And that's saying that the two things that are linked by the necessarily if and only if are such that the second one analyzes the meaning of the first one, even though it doesn't mean exactly the same thing. To give an example, we could say necessarily X is a square if and only if X is an equilateral, equiangular rectangle. I don't think it's too plausible to say that those two are synonyms. It seems to be a discovery that a square is a rectangle that is equilateral and equiangular. Somebody might know what a square is without knowing that it's a rectangle. But no one could know that a television isn't a TV, right? Because they just mean the same thing. One's just an abbreviation for the other is just a way of saying that a television is a television, right? Because TV just means television. But you could have the concept of a square without having analyzed it or broken it down into equiangular, equilateral, and rectangular. So that's considered an analysis. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, famously sought after analyses of different concepts. Like he asked Socratic questions like, what is justice, what is beauty, what is wisdom, what is truth, and so on. Coming up with an answer is a difficult matter. Mathematics provides the clearest cases of analysis. So you could ask, like, what is a triangle, and then define what a triangle is in terms of its geometric properties. So that's called a philosophical analysis. So my example was X is a square necessarily, which I'll just abbreviate AEC. Necessarily X is a square if and only if X is an equilateral, equiangular rectangle. And you could break it down further, right? You could then define rectangle as a four-sided closed figure and break it down into further steps. Then you'd get X is a square if and only if X is a four-sided closed equilateral equiangular figure. That would be your definition. And that's called a Socratic analysis. We still have this necessarily if and only if, but it's not, we can't consider the analysis just to be an abbreviation of the thing because it gives us some new knowledge that we can have. Right? Non-linguistic knowledge. I mean, you might say, well, television is TV, teaches you that TV is an abbreviation for television. Okay. But that's not knowledge about the nature of a TV. It's just linguistic knowledge. Here we're getting, in the case of the geometry definition, knowledge about the nature of what a square is, not just knowledge about words. So there's still a distinction. If that makes sense. All right. Now there's a third kind of case where you have an equivalence. It's neither a necessary equivalence, and it's not a synonymy, and it's not an analysis. It's just sort of an accidental necessary equivalence. And that's one sort of example anyway. That would be like necessarily 2 plus 2 equals 4, if and only if 7 plus 5 equals 12. Right? That's a necessary truth. But of course, 7 plus 5 being 12 doesn't tell us what 2 and 2 is being 4 is. It's not an analysis, nor is it a synonym. Right? So it's just like a necessary relation. Right? It just sort of holds. That 2 and 2 is 4 if and only if 7 and 5 is 12. And the reason that is that both 2 and 2 is 4 and 7 plus 5 equal 12 are necessarily true propositions in their own right. So they'll always be true if and only if the other one is true. But it's fairly uninteresting in this case. So there's a whole spectrum of these kinds of things where you can have this. So what's the status of the first one that we have here? Maybe it attempts to be an analysis, or maybe it's just saying that there's a connection. Doesn't seem to be a synonymy. So let's evaluate it now. Is it at all plausible as an account or equivalence pertaining to existence? That existence is relative to what people believe. That man is the measure. That something exists if and only if everybody believes in its existence. Well, as already been suggested, there are some problems with that. So the case of God's a really controversial case, just because there's so much dispute and uncertainty anyway about whether God exists or not. So we could prove the same kind of point hereafter using less controversial examples. Yeah.
But one could also say that the idea of what existence is also very subjective and controversial because, as me and my roommate always discuss, it's like for all we know, we're just sitting in a mental hospital right now, beating our heads against the wall. Because your only idea of what exists is what you perceive. So if you take that out of the equation, you really have no idea what is reality and what isn't.
Well, that goes back to sort of Descartes' meditations. He raised these kinds of doubts. But even he concluded that there were some things he couldn't doubt, that if he were in a mental institution hallucinating things, that he would still exist at least. And then from there, he reasoned that if he exists, then probably other things do too, and so on. And so, like he must have had a creator, since he couldn't have created.
Philosophical analysis of because you exist, other things exist as well.
Well, he said I couldn't have created myself, and I must have had a creator, it seems. So therefore, there are other things too. I'm not sure what they are. They might be my parents, or a God, or this, or that. It seems like there's something outside of me, in addition to me. Otherwise, I would myself be the ruler. I would be God. Then I wouldn't be in the mental. Right? So he went through this elaborate process of reasoning. Ultimately, to say that there is a distinction to be made between what's objectively there and what's subjectively in our minds. But that what subjectively exists in our minds, Descartes says, has an absolute existence in its own right, as a mental phenomenon. So it at least absolutely exists, like the hallucination itself. may not be a physical object. It may not be something that anybody else can observe. But I'm observing it, and it exists. And that's what Descartes said. At any rate, there seem to be two problems with our initial relativistic theory of truth here. So the first problem, it's possible that, say, some dog named Rover, it's possible that Rover exists, but that not everybody believes in Rover's existence. Isn't that possible? Like maybe Rover's some poor dog living in like a junkyard, in Hoboken, New Jersey, and like lots of people in China don't believe, right, in Rover's existence, right? So, isn't that possible? So it seems to give the wrong result that Rover exists only if everybody believes in his existence, because it could be that Rover exists even though lots of people never heard of Rover and don't believe in his existence. Problem one. Problem two. It's possible, right, that everybody believes in a flat Earth, like back in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, but that nevertheless a round Earth is what exists, not a flat Earth, even though everybody believes in a flat Earth.
So everyone can believe?
In a flat Earth, but that wouldn't mean that a flat Earth existed. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we're not talking about truth, we're talking about existence, but a similar point holds of truth. But, yeah, no, the point is that everybody could believe in a flat Earth, but it could be that what exists is a round Earth, because we're talking about existence here. So everyone believes in the flat Earth, but what actually exists is a round Earth. Okay, so we can, like, erase that one. That one's not good. Doesn't seem like there's any defense against, plausible defense against these two kinds of objections to that version, right? So we could revise it, though, and make a different version. We could say that it's too much to ask that everybody believe in the thing. What really matters is the more democratic theory, that you just need a majority. So the majority of people have to, if the majority of people believe in it, then it exists. Otherwise, not. Okay. And now we could say, even though there are still some people who believe in a flat Earth, like members of the Flat Earth Society, even today, right? That doesn't mean that the Earth is flat, because the majority of people today believe in a round Earth. Okay. So let's try this one then as an alternative to this. Necessarily for any x, x exists if and only if the majority of people believe in x's existence. So we could say, well, Santa Claus doesn't exist because even though some kids believe in his existence due to the propaganda given to them by their parents, the majority of people, you did a head count, don't believe in Santa in the literal sense. Of a guy in a red suit who's very chubby and has a white beard and drives a sled around in the air. Comes down your chimney delivering toys. So necessarily for any x, x exists if and only if the majority of people believe in x's existence. All right, so problem one. What would still be a problem for this? Well, we still have the original problem with Rover, don't we? Right? It's still possible that Rover exists, but the majority of people don't believe in Rover's existence. Right? That could stop. Right? He's just a lonely dog. People don't know about. But there's a a new problem now, problem 2 for this, which is that it seems to imply that the shape of the Earth will change over time. Although now the majority of people are round Earth believers. Right? They're round Earthers, the majority. Once upon a time, the majority were flat Earthers, right? So that shift in belief occurred around 1492. So around then, the Earth's shape changed from flat to round, if this theory is right. However, that's ridiculous, correct? If that had occurred, there would have been catastrophic physical consequences as the Earth's shape changed from flat to round, such as incredibly huge and powerful worldwide earthquakes and floods. Everything would have collapsed, right? And life probably would have been wiped out, or at least set back billions of years. Maybe some protozoa would have survived. Bacteria, but that's about it. But none of that ever happened, did it? In 1492. Shape of the Earth didn't go from flat to round. So that doesn't seem, right? Work. So it seems like at this point, the only way to go is to modify this by introducing some kind of egocentric relationship that is relativizing truth to individuals. I'll show you what I have in mind here. So we'd say necessarily for any x and any person s, so now things start to get weird, because now we're talking about existence for given individuals. The idea now is that different things exist for different individuals, which is kind of weird. So we get necessarily for any x and for any person s, x exists for s if and only if s believes in x's existence. So we're saying now that if you're a flat Earth believer, then for you a flat Earth exists, but if you're a round Earth believer, then for you a round Earth exists. This is a whole new thing now. We've introduced this for relation within the idea of existence. So we started out trying to define, give some equivalences about existence, but now we've shifted, right, from existence to existence for this person or that person. That raises a lot of perplexing questions, that move. So it's the move from giving a biconditional concerning x's existence simpliciter or tout court, right? X is existing just per se, versus x existing for this person or for that person. So what's meant by this expression, x exists for s, and how, if at all, does it relate to the simpler phrase, x is existing, just the assertion that x exists, as opposed to existing for this person or that person. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, under this argument, it would make sense because technically it does exist, even if it's just an abstract thought in that person's mind.
Yeah.
So it does exist. So the
yeah, those things would exist as thoughts. Yeah.
Despite being real or not, it's still existing. So.
Yeah, but this is talking about any x. not just thoughts. Well, maybe it's okay for thoughts that they exist for this person and not for that person. But when it comes to like mountains and planets, it's not so clear we want to talk that way. Or for Rover. Now look, the most natural reading, I think, of X exists for S is that it simply means S believes in X's existence. I mean, that would be the simplest thing to say that Santa Claus exists for Mary seems to just be to say that Mary believes in Santa Claus. Right? And that's all it seems to come down to. Now, if that's right, then this seems to reduce to a trifling proposition. It reduces to the tautology or triviality that necessarily for any X and any person S, S believes in X's existence if and only if S believes in X's existence, which is of no philosophical interest whatsoever. It's just like being told it's raining if and only if it's raining. It just doesn't tell us anything of interest or significance about existence. It's just a repetitive tautology that says you believe that X exists if and only if you believe it. It tells you nothing about existence. And I emphasize that's really the simplest understanding and the most straightforward and natural understanding of what it could possibly mean to say that something exists for a given individual. Is just simply that they believe it exists, or they believe in its existence. So it doesn't seem like we're really getting anywhere by doing this. We seem to be rather conflating or mixing up. We're subsuming existence to belief. We're conflating the existence of something with a belief in its existence. And that seems wrong. There seems to be a clear difference between something's existing and somebody's believing that it exists. Somebody might believe all kinds of things exist. That doesn't mean they exist, right? Like I could believe that the tooth fairy exists and puts money under my pillow as my baby teeth fall out. But that doesn't mean that there is a tooth fairy, right? It might be my parents that are putting the money under my pillow that I discover every month, right? And in fact, that's what turns out to be the case. But even if it didn't turn out to be the case, it would have been possible for it to turn out to be the case. And that's all that's needed in order to make the point that this doesn't seem to be putting forward anything significant. Not if we interpret it in the most economical and natural way. However, we don't have to do that. We could go with a more sophisticated understanding. So according to this understanding, this definition here entails that different persons, okay, literally inhabit different worlds. So the flat earth believer is in a wholly different universe than the round earth believer. So this bifurcates the universe into as many different worlds as there are different individuals with different opinions. And there'll be a different world for everybody with a different belief. So if you believe that God exists, then for you God exists. And what that means is in your universe God does exist. But in the atheist universe, given that he believes God doesn't exist, right? There's not going to be a God, and that's going to be what exists for him is a godless universe. And what exists for you is a God. And you're just in different universes, right? Because you can't have a single universe in which both God exists and God doesn't exist. So it must be that there are just different universes for different believers. Of course, this is going to make it impossible for any two people to sincerely disagree with each other. If we do this, because everybody will be right about the universe that they're in, right? If you're a flat earther, then there does exist for you a flat earth in your universe, and so you're not really disagreeing with the round earther who says that the earth is round, who believes in the existence of a round earth. Okay. And both parties are correct. But the subject matters are different. They're in different universes. One that has a round Earth. Do we really want to go that way? It doesn't seem super attractive. It seems to be a serious problem that we have to toss out the whole idea of disagreement. It seems like a huge problem. It seems like people can and do disagree. And that part of the sort of intellectual history of mankind involves, disputes between different parties who disagree about, like, say, whether the Earth is the center of the universe or the sun or whatever, right? And they battle it out, and one view comes out to be have more evidence in favor of it than another, and it turns out to be the view that we accept, that there exists a heliocentric universe rather than a geocentric universe. Rather than both views are right, and they're just about different universes. So what do you think? That would be a really big problem, right? No disagreement. Also, the notion that you have all these multiple universes seems quite odd, and it seems unnecessary, because we could just interpret X exists for S as S believes in X's existence and avoid all this, right? And just say, we're just talking about belief and not about existence. So why take this step? Well, why make things all weird and messy and complex? It seems to violate a basic principle of scientific and metaphysical reasoning, a methodological principle of scientific and philosophical method known as Occam's razor, which says that one should not multiply things unnecessarily. So why should we multiply universes in this way if we don't need to? And we don't need to. Because we could just say, X exists for S just means that S believes in X. In which case, of course, these views about truth turn out to be insignificant and no philosophical interest or value, but that's okay. Existence doesn't have to be understood as a relative. It can be understood, and I think ordinarily is understood as an absolute thing. Something exists and is real, or it isn't. Like that, say, Rover exists and is a real being, and Crypto, Superman's dog, doesn't have that quality, right? He's an imaginary, non-existing entity. I think there are further questions raised about whether you can even have communication between different individuals on this kind of view. And once you say that each individual is in his own world, can individuals in different worlds even communicate with each other? They may think they're communicating with each other, but are they really? They're in different universes. It seems like for individuals to be able to communicate, there must be some things in common which they're both aware of that provide a basis for communication. It seems like we can communicate with each other, for example, because we're aware of some of the same things, like the same table, or the same qualities like roundness and rectangularity, or whatever, some things in common that we're both aware of, right? Like colors or objects, whatever. If you had two beings that were not aware of any of the same things, then what basis would they have for communication via some kind of common language? It's difficult to see how that would occur. And it's unclear that individuals inhabiting these different worlds would have any such awareness in common, because none of the same things exist in their different universes. They're different universes, after all, with potentially we don't really have any way of saying. So it raises serious difficulties about whether communication is possible. I'm not concluding that communication is impossible for these, but I'm saying there are serious doubts about it. So it's a problem, further problem.
So you're saying that, I think of people, for example, in North Korea, even if they speak our same language, either Korean or English,
Right.
we could still communicate, but it would be difficult, as you said.
It's difficult, but it's possible because we can make a translation manual. But that's because when we look at things, we see some of the same things. Like when we both look at a dog, we see
Right.
the same dog. But in this model, people who disagree with you, like who believe in a flat earth, whereas you believe in a round earth, you're in different worlds. Right? They're in a world in which it's true that there's a round earth. God knows what that world's like. I mean, the world with the flat earth, God knows what that world's like, right? And we only know of it through our own belief that we believe that there are people who believe that there's a flat earth. So their belief in a flat earth is their existence, right, as flat earth believers. They only exist relative to our believing that they exist, right, according to this type of theory. So we don't really have any kind of direct way of saying what's going on in their world at all, since it's filtered through our subjective. Nothing exists except insofar as we believe it to exist. So when we say that there are people who have other beliefs that, to the effect that there's a flat earth, right, we only believe that they exist. They exist only insofar as we believe that they exist. Such believers who have these alternative conceptual schemes exist only insofar as we believe them. And so their existence and what goes on in their world becomes very tenuous for us. And we have no idea whether we can really understand anything of this. And this could lead, in turn, to a view known as solipsism. What solipsism says basically is my world is the world, and I am the arbiter and determiner of what exists. Oneself is, whoever the oneself happens to be, right? For each of us, it would be us. Right? So skepticism about the existence of other minds, which would be supported, I guess, if you were in doubt about whether you could communicate with anybody. I mean, if you couldn't communicate with anybody, what reasons would you have to believe that other people existed, right? It might just be unthinking things, right? Like we can't communicate with rocks. That's because they have nothing to communicate. Maybe the reason we can't communicate with these other beings is because they're not minds at all, right? They don't have thoughts. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. We don't know. So we begin to doubt whether there are other minds. We can't communicate with them. You put that together, we seem to be inching towards the solipsistic view that I am the arbiter and determiner of everything that is real. And that's known as solipsism. It seems to be a really nasty, unpalatable kind of view. Solipsist basically says, and this is a form of relativistic existence as well, it says necessarily for any X, X exists if and only if I believe in X's existence. Right, so I am the arbiter and determiner. Now this I here could be whoever. It's the solipsist. Like it could be me, for me, or you, or anybody. Taking the stance that something exists if and only if oneself believes in its existence. So I don't think we want to wind up there. So it doesn't look like relativism works out too well. Hard to come up with a consistent, coherent, relativistic view of existence. So there seems then to be an alternative, which is the commonsensical idea of absolute existence. Things just exist, or they don't quite independent of what our beliefs are about them. And this would apply both to non-thinking things and thinking things, right? So a rock may exist, a stone may exist, whether anybody believes it to exist or not, and the same thing for a mind. A mind may exist, whether there are other minds that believe in it or not. And it may exist even if it doesn't believe in its own existence, like it might be unconscious for a while, right? An unconscious mind might exist for a while, it seems, and then regain consciousness. It doesn't seem like it has to believe in its existence for it to exist. As a the solipsist would have to say, if I stop believing in my own existence, I go out of existence. Right? But we may not agree with that. We may say, no, if you believe in absolute existence, you could say you still may exist even though you've stopped believing in your existence because you're unconscious now. You've been put in a state of dreamless sleep or suspended animation. And have stopped believing in your existence, but you still exist now. So that would be absolute. Okay, so that's relativism as a form of anti-metaphysics. The next one is nihilism. This one was put forth by another sophist, same school of thought as Protagoras. His name was Gorgias. This is the doctrine that nothing exists. So there's no work for metaphysics to do. Because there isn't anything at all in the first place. Gorgias put forth this argument. He said, he argued for three propositions. The first was nothing exists. The second was, if something does exist, right, if perchance I'm wrong in my first statement, if something does exist, it's totally unknowable. That was, anyone know what that's called? That's called the doctrine of that nothing is knowable. It's called skepticism. Okay, so nothing exists. If anything exists, it's totally unknowable. And he had a third fallback. If something's knowable, it's incommunicable, which goes back to the argument we were just talking about before with solipsism. He says, if anybody does know anything, right, they can't communicate. So those are his three propositions for which he argued. This view is called nihilism, the view that nothing exists whatsoever. The nihilist believes in nothing. So nihilists have to reject metaphysics, since metaphysics presupposes that there's something to exist that we want to find out what that is, and characterize its nature and how it relates, perhaps, to other things that exist. So what's wrong with this view? Well, I think probably one of the good refutations of this is Descartes' pronouncement that however skeptical we want to be, we seem to at least to know that we ourselves exist. I know that I exist, so something exists. If I try to doubt that I exist, I find that in so doubting, I'm still assuming my existence as the doubter of my existence. So I can't get away from myself existing. Another refutation is that the assertion that nothing exists is self-referentially incoherent or self-refuting. Because in asserting that nothing exists, you're implying in practice that something does exist, namely your assertion that nothing exists. So something does exist. Your assertion or statement that nothing exists. And if it doesn't, then you never said anything, right? So we can ignore you. Right. We can ignore the nihilist's claim that nothing exists because he never said it.
And I'm not sure if this would be pro or anti-nihilist, but the idea that if something is knowable, it cannot be communicated, how would you communicate the idea that something is unknowable? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess Gorgias you only get to that if anything's knowable.
right, and he only gets that if something exists. So
Yeah. And he says nothing exists to start with, which means nothing is knowable. Now it's true that he can't know that nothing exists, but it could still be accurate that nothing exists. It could still be true. But it would be unknowable. It would have to just be a belief. It would have to be a belief. But then you get back to the problem of the belief that nothing exists. Mm-hmm. That's the self-referential incoherence objection to nihilism. It's also related to Descartes' criticism, too, because Descartes says that I can know for certain both that I exist and that I think, right? That I have thoughts. So at least either me or my thoughts exist, including the thought that nothing exists. That thought must exist. If I have that thought. Right? Yeah, so nihilism isn't going to get us anywhere. Okay, the third objection to metaphysics is skepticism, which we just also touched on briefly. There are two main types of skepticism. Pyrrhonian skepticism, which was founded by Pyrrho of Elis around 360 to 270 BC. And the second kind of skepticism is academic skepticism, which was associated with Carneades, 214 to 129 BC. It's called academic skepticism because Carneades and his followers were members of Plato's Academy, though in a much later time than when Plato first founded it. The Academy didn't start out as skeptical, but later on they kept on becoming more and more cautious until they turned into skeptics.
what was the first form of skepticism?
That's called Pyrrhonian skepticism. Named after Pyrrho, P-Y-R-R-H-O, Pyrrho of Elis. So let me explain briefly the difference between the two. The Pyrrhonian skeptics basically say you shouldn't believe anything. Don't even have beliefs. Though they do carve out a little area of exception for that. Really, strictly what they're saying, you shouldn't have any beliefs except for beliefs in things that are totally self-evident. What can be totally self-evident? Perhaps the Cartesian propositions we spoke of, right? Like that I think and that I exist and so forth, or I feel a pain. Pyrrho said you could believe in those things because you really have no choice. Like if you feel a pain, you feel it, right? So how can you help but believe it, right? You can't really not believe that you have a toothache. I mean, that you feel this horrible pain when you're feeling horrible pain, right? So Pyrrho was willing to exempt those, but he said other than those that very small class of mental state propositions about beliefs about your immediate, direct thoughts and feelings, and maybe perhaps the fact of your own existence. So aside from that, you shouldn't believe anything. Have no beliefs about things outside of your mind at all. You should not be forming beliefs about these things because you don't have any kind of credible evidence. These things are all unknowable. So suspend your belief altogether, except for that very narrow beliefs about things within the circle of your own ideas. Exempting that, believe nothing. So you shouldn't be having metaphysical beliefs, like the structure of the cosmos, or that there exist material objects, or that there are souls and spirit. You can't have any metaphysical beliefs. Like you can't even believe that, like, tables and chairs and a swivel camera, or that other people exist, right? You can't. You shouldn't be having any beliefs about those things. They thought that that was the way to achieve inner peace, was through suspending beliefs. They thought that we have too many beliefs and they bedevil the mind and make us hurt. And if we just didn't believe in anything, we'd be a lot better off.
Sounds like the basis for religion.
They kind of held an ostrich philosophy. You know how the ostrich is said to put its head in the sand? Like a herd of buffalo is charging toward it. It sticks its head in the sand and says, "What? Me worry? What I don't know, what I put all this stuff out of my mind." But it's not clear how they can really argue against metaphysics. I mean, they themselves can say they have no beliefs. That's fine. But how do they persuade other people to, like, follow along with them? I mean, what argument can they make? They don't believe anything.
Yes.
So they can't put forward any kind of argument to convince others of their argument.
Especially if they don't believe in them in the first place. So.
Yeah, they don't believe in anything. The only thing they believe in is that they themselves exist and that they feel certain things, but those won't get you to any kinds of conclusions about what sorts of knowledge might be possible for other people. So if they don't want to believe anything, that's fine for them, but they really can't offer any compelling reason, because in order to do that, they would have to say, I've got some beliefs that entail certain skeptical conclusions, which they don't have any such beliefs. So we can ignore them, right? The academic skeptics, a little more trouble. The academic skeptics basically said that probability is the guide of life, and they distinguished between knowledge and probable opinion, which is, I think, a very legitimate distinction. For example, seeing a cloudy day in the morning, you might conclude that it's probable there will be precipitation later in the day, but you don't know that there will be precipitation later in the day. Right? So one can have a probable belief that does not reach the level of knowledge. Knowledge would require more substantial evidence, or a much higher degree of probability, and they claim you can never reach that degree of evidence or probability to ever know anything at all. So academic skeptics don't say that you shouldn't have beliefs. They say you can believe things that are more likely than not, and that's all fine. They just deny that there's any knowledge. They say for any proposition P, nobody knows that P. And they claim to be able to back that up. They claim that they can argue for that by using propositions that are likely or probable, right, which add up to a conclusion that probably we can't know anything through various arguments. Like we can't trust our senses because our senses are unreliable and conflict with each other, and they have all kinds of arguments. Right? In order to know something, you must be able to prove it, but to prove that, you also have to prove the elements of your proof, which requires further elements that need to be proved, and you either go off into an infinite series of proofs, but the human mind is finite and our time is finite, or you get a circle of proofs, which you could do in a finite period of time, but it would be valueless and circular reasonings of no substance, or you reach a stopping place, which would be a self-evident truth. So they deny that there are any self-evident starting points. They claim that probability is the most we can ever reach, because none of our faculties are infallible. They're all susceptible to error. So they're not willing to accept anything as self-evident. Now, while Pyrrhonian skepticism wouldn't allow metaphysics to be done, they can't really mount an argument at all against metaphysics since they don't believe anything, or much, or enough to argue against the possibility of metaphysics. The academic skeptics, though, don't really have any proof that metaphysics is impossible. They just can prove, if they're right, that metaphysical knowledge is impossible, that we can't know which metaphysical theory is true. That still leaves the door open to a view which says this metaphysical theory should be accepted because it's more probable than these other metaphysical theories. And we have a similar situation in empirical science. Right? Maybe we can't prove which scientific theory is true. They're always changing after all, right? They're always revising them. But we might say, given our current evidence, this theory is the most likely, so this is the one we will accept. So it seems like academic skepticism is not necessarily anti-metaphysical. And it just says that you have to base your theories on probability, which I think is probably right. Why do we have to insist on having knowledge? Well, during the age of reason and enlightenment, there were all these metaphysicians like Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, known as rationalistic philosophers, who believed you could establish the structure and order of the universe through a priori reasoning and prove absolutely, and have absolute knowledge of the correct metaphysical view of the universe. That's roundly rejected by all contemporary philosophers today. So I think we have to go with the, in metaphysics and in science, with some kind of version of the academic view that we can't attain to conclusive proof in these matters. We'll go with the theory that provides the most probable or best account, and admit that it might have to be revised later. But it's still, if it's cloudy, we'll believe that rain is likely until it turns out that it doesn't rain. And we know it could be wrong, and so in doing metaphysics, we always have to have an open mind and be open to alternative arguments, because they might turn out to be good arguments. It's a ongoing process. All right, so on that note, we've come to the end for today, so I'm going to sign off, and I'll see you next Tuesday.